Hello all, my name is Ahmed Tabaqchali and I'm the Chief Strategist of the AFC Iraq Fund. The AFC Iraq Fund was up 110% last year. That is, we think, according to our research, probably the best fund in the world who is actually has to be sort of like, of its class, unleveraged, actively managed, generalist, and this year we're up 42% on top of that. So in a sense, what drove that? What drives that? Currently, Iraq is enjoying a significant economic boom brought by about three main factors, and I think these are quite important to note. The first is the period of relative stability. Iraq has enjoyed a period of relative stability post-COVID. Now, for the rest of the world, post-COVID has actually been a very turbulent time, but in Iraq's own history, it's a very stable time compared to the history of conflict, which I'll go in the background of the last 4.5 decades. So that's one. Basically what it did is allowed individuals and businesses to plan on capital expenditures on a scale we have not seen since the golden years of the 70s. Secondly, the government in place since October 22 has benefited from higher oil prices in 2022, significant surpluses, to have a 3-year ending in 25 super expansionary budget, which is injecting huge amounts of liquidity into the economy. Finally is the changes that took place at the end of November 22 in the way we interact with the outside world when it comes to fund transfers. Basically what it did, it enabled or accelerated the transformation to banking. Iraq is a country that is mostly cash dominated and so forth, and so part of our thesis is that the banking will alter the economy. And this has accelerated that. The three factors drove the performance last year and the performance this year, and we believe it has the potential that there are far more legs to these three factors that will drive returns for the next few years. What we believe differentiates the AFC Iraq Fund from the other funds that are either looking at Iraq or, i.e. Iraq specialists or frontier markets that look into Iraq. To understand a country in a way, you need some sort of unique perspective. Me, as an Iraqi who basically is both at home in Iraq as well as in the West, the reason for that is the fact that I am a son of a career diplomat and I spent almost all of my life living and studying throughout the whole world, in Iraq and outside Iraq. So in a way, I fit culturally, I believe, as well as not only language, but culturally. I understand both cultures in a way which I believe gives me a unique edge in understanding Iraq. Because the thing is with Iraq is, I mentioned earlier the enormous potential that the country has. Most people who look at Iraq see that and they sort of, in a sense, fall in love with it. And I understand, in a sense, what the damage of the 4.5 years of conflict did to the country. One of the things that it did, it destroyed its capacity to function in a way. So not only do we benefit from Thomas's enormous long-term experience in looking at various markets, because many countries share very similar characteristics. People throughout the whole world in the various development stages share the same aspiration, the same needs. So that gives us an enormous benefit in looking at those. Where I come in is the boots on the ground. I am an Iraqi as well as a Brit, but I've also lived throughout the whole world, all over the world. Now, for those who know Iraq or think they know Iraq, let me sort of say in a way what really Iraq is. Iraq is a country of an exceptional opportunity, and I don't mean just today, because basically, if you look at Iraq, Iraq is obviously in the Middle East. It's an oil-producing country. It is part of what is known, or what was known as Mesopotamia. It's very different than many other countries in the region, but let's be sort of realistic in terms of what the country offers in a way. One, it's a very large country, a population now of 45 million, mostly are young, growing rapidly, and the youth bracket is growing quite a lot. That by itself is phenomenally attractive. Now, the country, by the way, has enormous resources. Over the years, we've had the Tigris, that's where Mesopotamians come from, but what it means for us, the land is exceptionally rich. And culture, so you got land, people, and we've got natural resources. You name it, whatever is there, we have it. However, that whole potential came to a standstill pretty much in 1980, when the Iran-Iraq war started. That was a bloody 8-year conflict in which almost 1 million people died on both sides, on both Iraq and Iran, and set the country back decades. What really set it down in a way was the invasion of Kuwait and the subsequent sanctions. Iraq was under sanctions from something like, I think, summer of 1990 all the way to 2003, pretty much the most severe sanctions you can think about in a sense. If that wasn't enough, we've had the US invasion in 2003 that was soon followed by insurgency that developed into a civil war. Once that was over, sort of like 2009, 2010, the country barely had a chance to breathe. Then we had the ISIS invasion, in which by Mosul fell, almost a third of the country fell. What I'm trying to say basically is that this whole potential of a country was held back by this decades of conflict. Not only the potential was held back, but because of being under an authoritarian rule in the 1980s and 1990s, it pretty much meant that Iraq was almost close to the outside world. So we don't have a developed banking system. We are almost all cash dependent. The country the economy is almost all informal. So you can imagine it has multiple drivers of performance. The drivers are what? The move towards rebuilding after conflict. That by itself can generate enormous returns. But on top of it, you have the drivers of the country joining the rest of the world, i.e. we develop a banking system. And every country, everyone who's seen a frontier market or an emerging market, it always starts with banks. Banks increase the amount of money in the economy, they create lending for the private sector, and the private sector becomes possible. The multiplier effect is phenomenal. Finally, we have also the youth bulge. On top of that, we are a very young country. We have a large youth bulge and growing there. So it has an enormous potential. My father is a career diplomat. I was born and lived in Iraq and all over the place. I studied all over the place. So for example, my first 2 degrees in mathematics are in New Zealand. I finished my master's in Oxford in the UK. My work, in a sense as well, gives me another edge in looking at Iraq. I worked for US equity firms based in London, selling US equities to European institutional investors who are based in Europe. I worked in micro caps, large caps, small caps. All of these things not only did enable me to understand Iraq, what drives Iraq, and also what are the pitfalls in looking at Iraq. Now, in a way, the AFC Iraq Fund, for those who know, was launched in June of 2015. However, the history of the fund goes quite a bit longer. The history goes back to 2013 when I met my colleague Rusher, who in Erbil, Iraq, northern Iraq. That was during an investor conference. Rusher was at the time there as part of AFC, the Frontier Fund, which was investing in Iraq, but that's part of the what attracted me at the time to what Rusher was doing at what AFC was, is that they actually are on the ground. Not only do they invest in far frontier markets, but they actually are there on the ground. I happen to be on a separate business. I was working with a group of people as part of an advisory team working on the privatization of probably was, I think, the largest telecom or second largest telecom operator in the country. I happened to be there visiting the company, working with them, attending the conference as well, and that's where I met Rusher. Now, it was a meeting of minds. In time, I got to meet Thomas while he was coming into London marketing, got to talk to him, and got to like what AFC stands for. Almost like a year or so later, the fall of Mosul, which those of who know Iraq or know the history of Iraq, the second largest city, Mosul, fell to ISIS in June 2014. And that's sort of at the time when I sort of realized, or I believed at the time quite strongly, that it was the right time to look at investing in Iraq and to work on launching a fund. I discussed the idea with Thomas on one of his visits to London, and the idea was, let's work on that together. We spent a year overcoming a number of difficulties, basically Iraq's history of conflict, and one of them was a substantial period of time when Iraq was under sanctions that complicated life for us and complicates life for almost everybody who's looking at Iraq one way or the other. However, by June 2015, we were ready and we launched the fund. One of the things I'm talking about, in a sense, and I would invite everybody to look at, is the transformation that Iraq is undergoing. It is very difficult for people who hear the word Iraq, read the news, and see always the images of destruction. It's almost impossible for those people, in a sense, to see a transformation Iraq is undergoing. It's unbelievable the amount of transformation or the kind of transformation the country is undergoing. I saw it briefly in 2000 and I think 5, 6, and 7 when I was in Dubai. The kind of construction activity that is driving the country, Iraq is undergoing through that. It is doing that as well as the other factors that I mentioned earlier, i.e. the relative stability, the liquidity injection to the economy, as well as the relative stability, the banking changes. That is transforming Iraq in a way, and we believe it will drive the equity market and our fund's performance over the next few years.